Hello everyone and welcome to our Patient Callback webinar. During this session, we're going to be looking at our Patient Callback feature. So we'll be looking at what Patient Callback is. We'll be looking at setting up Patient Callback in Xflow, recognizing Patient Callback calls on the user console, and where you can find the Patient Callback report in the Reports console. Patient Callback is our automated callback system, which allows the practice to set parameters and set a limit for the queue. Once that limit has been reached, patients will be offered the callback option instead of staying on the phone in the queue. They can just press 1 on their telephone keypad, and that will hold their position as though they'd stayed on the phone, and will then ring the patient back once they reach the front of the queue. There's no additional work for the reception team, as the calls will just be slotted back in to the normal queue that they're answering. So an inbound call may say contacting caller, and then you'll hear the outbound ringing tone as the system rings the patient back automatically. Patient callback can be set up in Xflow, and you can access Xflow either via the single sign-on. So that would be the sso.x-onweb.com, via the menu, or via the service delivery console through the numbers section. Once accessed in Xflow, if you haven't used the service delivery console numbers section, you will then need to load the relevant call flow. So click on the load icon in the top left-hand corner, and then select the call flow from the list of flows on the system. Normally, it will be your main number call flow that you'll need to select, and that will then open up a graphical representation of your call flow on the screen. Patient callback is accessed within the group blocks in the call flow. So that will be the orange blocks that have the name of the various teams that you have set up within the practice. Patient callback is normally activated on the team that answers your appointments calls, as this tends to be the busiest queue first thing in the morning. Double click on the relevant group block, so in the coloured bar just up at the top, and that will then open up the parameters for you. So in the group properties, you then have a patient callback tab, and if you click on the patient callback tab, it will then offer the patient callback settings. The mode can be either off or voluntary. So if it's off, patient callback is not offered to any patients at all. If it's on its voluntary mode, that would then turn on patient callback and give the patient the option of taking the callback option if the threshold has been reached. So once you've selected voluntary on the right hand side, you'll then be able to set the threshold. So this is the limit of patients that will be in your queue before patient callback is offered. So in this example, we'd have 10 patients in our appointments queue. Patient number 11 that joins the queue will then be told that you're experiencing high levels of calls, so they can press 1 to actually book that callback there. You also have some advanced settings, and if you click on the advanced settings here, it will give you the option to change the number of callback attempts that we make to that particular patient. So most practices leave it at the 1 default attempt, and that will then call the patient back when they would have reached the front of the queue. However, you can change those attempts up to 2 or 3. And if you do that, you can also change the delay in between the attempts up from more than 30 seconds to perhaps a minute or a minute and a half. There is also a reset time on the patient callback option. So we would recommend that you reset any callbacks towards the end of the day, usually an hour before the end of the day. So when the phone lines are due to close, reset your callbacks an hour before then, and it will then cancel any callbacks booked after that point. You can also send out a text message to anybody that booked their callback on a mobile phone and wasn't available to answer when the callback call was completed. So if this attempt fails, with the mobile phone number, we can automatically send out a text message to that patient, and the text is in the box down at the bottom. It will also prioritise the call for the rest of the day for any missed callbacks, and it will do that for both landlines and mobile numbers. Once you've made any changes to the settings and the advanced settings, click on Save, and you'll then see that in your group block, you now have PC voluntary shown, so that you know that patient callback is activated on that particular queue. If you've made other changes, you may need to use auto arrange up at the top just to spread the call flow out so it's easier to read. And once you've made all your changes, remember to deploy the call flow to make those changes live on your main practice number. Patient callback calls can actually be seen on the user console screen. So I've got a screenshot here. Some of the details have been taken out so that you can't identify individual numbers here, but you can see calls, and the third one down here and the one down at the bottom are actually patient callback calls. So if you search in your archive calls, you'll be able to see the little callback icon that denotes when a patient requested their patient callback. Also on the system, you'll see the callback call, so it's going to look the wrong way around. So a minute after that call has been requested, you will see the callback call. It will look like your team, so it will show that the group is actually calling out to the number. So it's not them making a manual outbound call. It will show as queuing first of all, and when it should have reached the front of the queue, that call will then go through to one of the reception team, say contacting caller, and call that patient back on the number that they rang in on earlier. Any patients that withhold their number, patient callback won't be offered because there's no number to call them back on. So here we've found a patient that's done a callback request. So we've got the callback option here. If you search under that patient's telephone number, you would then see the callback, which is when it went into the virtual queue. Hovering over the duration in the pre-talk will tell you how long it was before we actually called that patient back. So the pre-talk for a patient callback call will show you how long they were in the virtual queue. And then when they reach the front, it will ring that patient back. So we can see our patient callback request here. We did call that patient back, and the actual time that we called them back will be the pre-talk time on top of their started call time, because that will always be a minute after the call was requested. We can also see, because we've searched under the patient's contact number, the GP call that was done as the consultation then to that particular patient as well. If we miss any patient callback calls, they will also be shown on your user console. So again, I've searched under a patient that has requested patient callback, and we can see that the system here was set up to do 3 callback attempts, and you can see each of those callback attempts here, and the little red phone with a cross through means that that call wasn't answered. So we can see each of the calls where the team tried to call that patient back when they reached the front of the queue again, and those calls didn't go through. This number would now be prioritized, so if they ring back later in the day to find out why they didn't get that call back, that call will be pushed to the front of the queue so that they definitely get answered this time into the practice. There is a patient callback report in the reports console, so you can see how many patient callback calls have been handled, and you can actually do that on an hourly basis. So you can either navigate to the reports via the single sign-on again, so going back to your single sign-on screen and selecting reports from the single sign-on there, or you can use the menu in the user console just up by your initials and then access the reports console directly from there as well. Once in the reports, if you go into the group report section, there is a patient callback report. I've run the report here, and you can see that we had 85 calls active whilst patient callback was switched on. So that means that we had 85 calls in the queues when patient callback was activated, so we know it had gone over the threshold. The actual patients that booked patient callback calls between 8 and 9 were 12 calls, and between 9 and 10, there were 32 patient callback calls booked. You can also see how many of those calls have been completed. The difference in numbers will be the time between 9 and just after. So it will have been requested just before 9, but the patient callback time was actually after 9. So the figures don't match perfectly, but they would add up over the day there. You can also see any callback attempts where the timeout was exceeded, and also if patients call back in when they have a callback booked. So this particular patient didn't wait for the patient callback call. They rang back in to find out what was going on. When they do call back in, if they haven't had their callback yet, they're giving a couple of options. So they can either put the phone down and wait for the original callback call, which will keep them in the callback queue, and then we'll call them back when they would have reached the front of the queue again. Or they have the option to rejoin the queue, and that will then pop them into the queue at the position that their call has now got to. So they're not missing out on any time where they were in the virtual queue there. Or finally, as an option, they can actually cancel the callback. So if anybody does call back in and decide that they don't need that callback, they can then cancel it, and you'll then see that in the column that marks as any callback caller ring back in cancelled there. You've also got at the end of the table here the various times. The total time in the virtual queue is for all of the patient callback attempts that have been made. So that could be quite a high time. Here we can see we've got 9 hours within the hour because we had 32 calls that were waiting for callbacks there. On an average for those calls though, it was 1/4 of an hour that they were waiting in that virtual queue. So that would give you an idea of how long your queues were at the time that patient callback was turning on there. You can also see how much time that they sent in the real queue waiting. This will be fairly minimal, but that's the time where they are offered patient callback and then press 1. And then if they do need to wait for a receptionist when they call back in, it would also include that time there.